Hey everyone! Today on the plastic canvas we're painting the church servants from Bloodborne by CMON Games. Hey everyone, Matt here from the Plastic Canvas and welcome to the 8th episode in this Bloodborne Painting Series, and today we are painting the church servants. These are one of the enemy types that you'll face in this adventure and exploration game from CMON Games. So after finishing the last mini that I worked on, which was Vicar Amelia, I then went back to the box to try and work out which mini I was going to be painting next. And with what I had left, just as the minis on their own with no artwork yet to go off, none of them really stood out to me as ones that were going to be particularly interesting to paint. Because like I've said a couple of times earlier in the series, I have a very limited experience with playing the Bloodborne video game, so for the main part, I don't actually know what any of these enemies are going to look like. With the church servants here, for example, I just assume that they will probably have brown leather cloaks on, and brown is a colour that I've used plenty in this series so far, so I didn't think it was going to be anything different. So, because none of the minis just on their own were standing out to me as ones that were going to be particularly interesting to paint, I then needed to have a look at their artwork to see if anything in there stood out to help me sort of draw them into painting any of them in particular. And here we can see the card for the church servants, and as soon as I saw this card, I knew that these guys were who I was going to be painting next, and that pretty much all came down to the colour of their hat and their cloaks, that really light grey, almost white colouring there. And there were two main reasons why I was drawn in by that colouring. The first is that it is just such a contrast to everything else that I've painted in this series so far. So here you can see a couple of pictures of some other minis that I've painted so far from Bloodborne, and you can see there's lots of greens, blues, greys, browns, those sorts of colours, and a lot of it is washes over a zenithal undercoat. So it gives a really gritty, dim, dark, almost dirty sort of colouring and look to them, which I think fits really well with this theme. But then the church servants, they're almost clean and pristine in comparison, which is just such a contrast to everything else that I've painted so far, so I knew it was going to be quite different to paint. And then the other reason why I was drawn in because of the colouring of their hat and cloaks is because light grey, almost white, is such a notoriously difficult colour to work with. Because being such a light colour to start with, it's difficult to shade and make darker, but then also because it's so light, it's difficult to highlight because you can't really go a whole lot brighter than that. Now, I have painted other minis before that have been very light grey, almost white, like the soldiers that you can see here from Zombicide Invader, but it has been quite a while. So I figured this would be a good check-in to see how my painting has progressed, because I can take how I paint these cloaks, the way that I'm able to highlight and shade them, and compare them back to other minis that I've painted in the past that have similar colouring, just to see if I'm able to do a better job or not. So those are a couple of the reasons why I was so drawn into painting these guys, and so the main focus of this video will be how I highlight and shade their cloaks and their hats, but there'll be a couple of other little things as well, like doing the OSL effect from the lantern and a bit of a rust effect on their staff thingy as well. Now, while I don't actually end up trying to make the cloaks look as though they are white, I more go for light grey, one thing that I have found when trying to paint white in the past is to not actually paint it white. And there's two main reasons for this. The first is that if you actually look around at things that are around you, there are very, very few things that are truly white or truly black. Most things are either a very, very light grey or a very, very dark grey rather than true white or true black. And so straight off the bat, if you're actually trying to paint something to look truly white or truly black, they just don't quite look natural, because there aren't that many things around that are truly white or truly black. So if you're painting something that is supposed to be white, I find a much, much better colour to start with is a very, very light grey, which is like what I have done here. But the other reason why starting with light grey is better than starting with white is because light grey is just a much, much easier colour to both shade and to highlight. Highlighting's a no-brainer because if you're starting with white and then trying to highlight that, well, where do you go? You can't make white any brighter. I mean, sure, there are different shades of white, but at the end of the day, if you base coat with one white and then highlight with another, it's just not going to be seen. Whereas if you start with light grey, at least you have somewhere to go to build up to and finish with white. And then also with the shading, because light grey, even though it is still a quite light colour, it has more depth to it than what white does, as in it's a darker colour, and so it is a deeper colour. And so when shading light grey, well, it's a lot easier to start to darken off the grey for the shadows than what it is to start with white and to try and darken that off. Because white is just such, obviously, an incredibly light colour, it is difficult to darken it. So first thing there, if you're trying to make something look white, start with light grey rather than white, and then it'll just make your time highlighting and shading it just so much easier. And so you might be thinking, well, if you start with light grey, it's just going to end up looking light grey. Well, you'll see as I start to do the highlighting later on, I end up with a really, really small area in comparison to the whole cloak that I finish with white as the highlight, but if you just cover a larger area with your final highlighting of white, you can then give the impression that whatever it is that you're painting, whether it's armor or a cloak, is supposed to be white, and that maybe it's just gotten a little bit dirty along the way, because in reality, like in this case here, with the church servants, if they've been out walking through the streets of Yharnam, their cloaks are not going to be as clean as what they once were. Same thing if you've got, say, a soldier wearing white armor through battles and things like that, it's going to have dirtied up a little bit, and so a very, very light grey is probably going to look more believable than what true white is going to. So, as you've seen so far with me painting this cloak, I started with Stonewall Grey as the base coat colour for all of the reasons that I just mentioned, and then now I'm a few layers into doing the shading. So for the first couple of layers, I've just took the Stonewall Grey, which I base coated with, mixed in some Stone Grey, which was a darker grey, and then I just blocked it into the area where I wanted the shadows to be at their darkest, and then cleaned the bristles off, and then with the bristles still wet, then just feathered out the edges away from where I wanted the shadow to be at its darkest, just to start to get a blend from the shadows through to the base coat colour. And after a couple of layers of just adding in more and more of the stone grey, I then got to a point where I then did a layer or two of just stone grey to start to really darken it off a little bit. And now I've got a little bit of black mixed in with the stone grey as well, just to continually darken it. But every layer, as it gets darker and darker, gradually covers a smaller and smaller surface area. But after blocking in the colour for each layer, I still clean the bristles off, and then with the wet bristles, feather out the edge so that it blends into the previous layer. And so what this will end up creating is a really nice smooth blend from the deepest part of the shadow, which will be quite a small amount of area, through the gradually lighter part of the shadows until it blends back into the base coat Stonewall Grey colour. And then the shading of all of those little ruffly parts that are at the bottom of the upper part of his cloak, just sort of going over his shoulders, was then a little bit different. It was all the exact same colours building up in the same amount of layers, but for them I was trying to concentrate the shadow on the bottom end of the ruffle so that it gradually got lighter as it moved in the direction towards his head, I suppose. So what I would do there is, again, block in where I wanted the shadow to be at its darkest, but then blend in an upwards direction. And then when I then darkened the grey off and did the next layer, I'd start at the bottom edge of that upper part of the cloak, but then just not go up as far as the previous layer, but then clean off the bristles and then just blend the end of that layer in that upwards direction again, so that it then transitions into the colouring of the previous layer. And then just keep repeating that, getting darker and darker and darker. Each time though, painting a shorter line starting at that bottom edge. You can see there that it was quite a short line there, and then just blend upwards so that in the end, the bottom part of each of those ruffles is the darkest part, and then it will gradually get lighter and lighter as it heads in an upwards direction until it then blends up into that Stonewall Grey, the base coat colour that I used, which is what's up on his shoulders there at the moment. But the keys here is just, first of all, to have your paints nice and thin so that when you're then feathering out the edges, it's really easy to blend it out. If your paint's too thick and dries too quickly, it's going to be much, much more difficult to do that. So have the paint nice and thin so that it's really, really smooth. But then also when you clean off the bristles and then go to feather out the edges, you need your bristles to be damp as well, because between having the damp bristles and then your nice smooth paint, it just makes it so much easier to gradually feather out those edges. Because the idea here is that as you feather out the edges, you gradually make it thinner and thinner and thinner, and as it gets thinner, more and more of the colouring underneath is allowed to show through. And so if you then go from a spot in the middle where you blocked in the colour, where it's at full opacity, it will be the colour that you put down, but then as you feather out the edge, it will gradually allow more of the undercoat colour to come through, and then if you do it over enough layers and you're smooth enough with your feathering, you'll then end up with a nice smooth transition from the colour that you just put down to then the colour that you put down beforehand. And obviously with layering, the more layers that you use, the smoother those blends are going to be, because you will have smaller jumps, for lack of a better word, between colours. And I could have easily used more colours. There's a couple of spots where my blends aren't as smooth as what I would like them to be, but when these guys are in the middle of the table, they just look really, really cool, and any imperfections in the blends, by the time everyone's sitting around the edge of the table and these guys are in the middle, you just can't see that. So these look really, really good when they're in the middle of the table, but if you do look up close, there's a couple of imperfections, but at the end of the day, I have other minis to paint. I can only spend so much time on these. But you can see now I'm doing the highlighting, and the highlighting is done in the exact same way as the shadows, just that I'm gradually adding more and more white to the Stonewall Grey instead of more and more black. So again, just lightening the colour off a little bit, blocking it in where I want the highlight to be its brightest, cleaning off the bristles, and then feathering out the edges away from where I want the highlight to be its brightest. So basically just feathering it out towards the shadows. And as it gets gradually thinner and thinner by feathering out the edge, it allows more and more of the undercoat colours to come through. And then that's where you get those nice smooth blends to go from your highlight through to the mid-tone colour and then into the shadows. And so, yeah, I just gradually add more and more white in each layer, but each layer gradually covers a smaller and smaller amount of surface area, feathering out the edges, and then eventually I get to highlighting with just pure white. That covers obviously the smallest amount of area out of any of the highlighting layers. So then I end up with a nice transition from the really, really bright white highlight through to the mid-tones and then down into those really, really dark shadows. Now, while in reality this bottom edge of the upper part of the church servant's cloak wouldn't actually have this sharp highlight to it, I just wanted to do this quick little bit of edge highlighting almost, I suppose, just to create a little bit more contrast between the bottom edge of the upper part of the cloak and the shadows that are underneath. So I just went around it just with the white that I've been using for the last layer of the highlighting, just really picked out the edge of each of those little ruffly parts, and that just created a nice little bit of contrast. So even though in reality that's not actually how it would be highlighted, I do think it added a little bit more depth, and especially once these guys are in the middle of the table and everyone is then sitting around the edge and seeing it from that distance, that just helps those little details just to stand out a little bit more. And so that is the hat and cloak done. So as you can see, I went with a very, very light grey sort of colour rather than trying to make it look pure white. But if with what you're painting you are actually going for white, I think the basic principles still stand. Start with a very, very light grey as opposed to white, because it makes your job of shading and highlighting just so much easier. But what you would be doing is, rather than ending up with a small area where you're highlighting with pure white, like I did, you would just be covering a larger amount of area so that you really then give the impression that the whole thing is white as opposed to just a very, very light grey. But I'm super, super happy with how these cloaks came up, especially those blends going from the deepest part of the shadows through to the brightest part of the highlights. I was a little bit stuck exactly on what to do with the hat because it is so flat. There wasn't really anywhere that there was going to be shadows, so I just painted the whole top side of it just that pure white. In reality, it's probably not going to just be a flat color, but I wasn't really sure of how to approach it, so I thought, if I just paint it white, that will really push the fact even more that these cloaks are such a light color. But in reality, it's probably not highlighted correctly. But anyway, it looks fine. I wasn't really going to worry about that. And now here, I'm just creating the glow that's emanating from these lanterns. I had a look online at colours that different people had used, those that had already painted the church servants, and there were a bunch of colours. I saw normal kind of flame sort of colours, I saw blues and purples and different things like that, and as you can see, purple is what I ended up settling on, because I thought that would just be a really cool kind of magical, eerie sort of colour, rather than going for just a normal flame sort of colour. So I just painted a dark purple edge, and then went to a lighter purple, just blobbed that into the middle, and then just kind of smudged, for lack of a better term, those colours together, just a bit of wet blending in there, and then just finished it with white, just right in the middle. I kind of picture that there would be still a candle inside the lantern, but it's just giving off a purple colour rather than a normal flame colour. So the brightest colour would be right there in the middle. So I finished it with white in there, just to make it look like the glow is its most intense right in the middle, and that the colour then gradually gets darker towards the edge as it cools off a little bit. And then after this, I'll then be starting off the OSL, so the object source lighting, so just to make it look as though the light that's being cast from the lantern is being cast across the surfaces around it. And I just do here the most simple, basic OSL that I figure you can probably do, because I don't actually try and build any atmosphere here. I think that would just take too long. And by atmosphere, I mean making it actually seem as though the parts of the church servant that are being hit by the light from the lantern is the only light that the church servant is being hit by, because I figure in reality these guys are probably outside at nighttime, and so their cloaks should probably actually be a really, really dark grey, because at nighttime, there's not going to be any light hitting them at all. So their cloaks just shouldn't actually be this light. And then that would create just a super amount of contrast between the parts that are being hit with light from the lantern and then the parts on the back that are being hit by no light at all. And just to kind of illustrate what I mean by that, here are some pictures of the hunter mobs that I painted, and you can see on their backs I painted them really, really, really dark browns and dark greys to make it look like they're in really, really dark shadow. And then as it comes around to the front, you get that really, really high contrast where it's getting hit by that intense light from the flaming torches. So there's a bit more atmosphere with them than what there is with these guys, because really, I should have painted the back sides of the church servants to be quite a dark grey, so that you get the impression that they are outside at night and that their backs are in really, really dark shadow, and then you get that nice contrast around their fronts where they're being hit by light from the lanterns. But I didn't worry about doing that, because I didn't really think I had to. I figured the look just from the OSL from the lanterns would be enough. So what I've done here is just gone to my amethyst purple, which is just that lighter purple that was used to create the glow in the lantern, and then just really, really thinned it down. This is probably 70 to 80% water. And then I just started by just laying it down anywhere that I thought any amount of light from the lantern would be hitting. And because the paint is so thin, each layer only makes a really, really small difference. And then once I'd blocked that in, I then hit it with the hairdryer to make sure that it was completely dry so that the next layer wouldn't mix with it at all. And then just laid the next layer on, still really, really thin down, but I just didn't quite cover as much surface area. I just shrunk it a little bit towards the lantern. And because there's now a part that has 2 layers of the amethyst purple as opposed to 1, you get a little bit more opacity. And then I just kept repeating that. So laying down the amethyst purple, hitting it with the hairdryer to completely dry it off, and then laying down the next layer, but just not covering as much surface area. And I just kept doing that until I'd built the amethyst purple up to the opacity that I wanted to, and by gradually reducing the surface area, that gives the impression that the areas that are closer to the lantern are being hit by more intense light than the areas that are further away that look like they're just being hit by a soft glow. And then once I'd gotten it to that point, as you can see, I have now started to mix in some white, and this is just to really boost the intensity of the light. Because if you look at the window in the lantern, there is that super intense white glow in the middle, and so I want to replicate that a bit on the church servant, and so that's why I've started to mix in the white. But here I'm now covering really, really small areas just immediately around the lantern, and mixing this white in is just really going to sell the fact that the lantern is giving off this bright light, and that the surfaces immediately around it are being hit by a super intense bright light that then gradually softens off until the outer limits of where the light is reaching, which is just that really, really soft glow that's created by that very, very first thin layer. And because it was so thin, it still allows the colors that were underneath to show through. So you can still see that there is some grey, either the dark grey or the light grey showing through, even though it is being hit by light. And then eventually I will just finish off by using just pure white, just to hit those edges that are closest to the lantern, just to really, really boost that final bit of contrast, just to really sell the look that the parts immediately around the lantern are being hit by that super intense light, and that it then gradually softens away from it. And that, I think, really is the main key to doing OSL, and just really giving the impression that that light source is actually giving off light, just building up that super intense bright color immediately around the light source that then just gradually softens off around the edge. Because if you look at things that are being hit by light, that is what happens. Not everything gets hit by a consistent amount of light. And I think where OSL can fall apart sometimes is because our eyes are just so familiar with looking at things under light, that then if you try and paint something to look as though it's being hit by light and you don't gradually build up that intensity, our eyes just naturally know that it's not quite right. And so while, you know, the directionality of the light's super important, I think building up this intense color immediately around the light source is the most important thing that you can be doing to really sell the effect that that light source is actually what's giving off the light. And now just to finish off the church servant, I'm going to start working on this staff sort of a thing that they're carrying. And my intention here was to use this as a way of showing that even though their clothing is quite clean in comparison to all of the other occupants of Yharnam, they're not actually any more well looked after than what they are. So I used a dry brush of sorts there to just kind of rough in the metallic sort of a color, because I didn't want it to look brand new. I wanted it to look a little bit sort of banged up. So by doing that dry brush sort of a technique there, it covered most of it with this scratchy sort of metallic finish, but it allowed some of the black to show through just to make it look as though it's had a few knocks and bangs and things like that. Then I just picked out some of the edges with that more bronzy sort of colour, because this is a staff from a church, and so there's probably going to be a little bit of embellishment there. And then the black wash over the top is just going to knock off all of the shine. And then here with the typhus corrosion, I'm going to start to build up a rust effect. Now this is just a really, really simple rust effect, but one that I think works pretty well for a mini of this quality. So just laying down the typhus corrosion where I want the rust to be its thickest, and then just feathering out the edge away from that, because in reality rust has a starting point and then it spreads from there, and that's the look that I'm trying to create here. So I'm just building up a thick texture where I want the rust to be its thickest, and then just feathering out the edge away from that where it's starting to spread, and then using the rust wash here just to tone it all up, just to give it that rusty kind of a colouring. And then I'll finish it with the Riser Rust dry brush, and I just do the same thing with that as I did with the typhus corrosion, lay it down where I want the rust to be its thickest, and then just feather out the edges so that then it gradually blends into the unrusted part of the staff. And then I just repeat that over a couple of layers, but then every layer I just feather it less and less and less until it builds up that thickest kind of rusty looking part that then gives the impression that it is spreading from that point. Alright, so just as I start to finish this rust effect and then just paint the base up black just to neaten it all up, our church servants are finished. So thank you very, very much for checking out another one of my videos. I really, really do hope that you enjoyed it and found something useful in there that you can take away and use in your own painting. If you did enjoy it, please do consider giving it a thumbs up, and if you haven't hit the subscribe button yet, please do hit that so that you can stay up to date with future videos as they keep coming out. There will be more Bloodborne videos coming out, as well as other games as we get new ones. Also, if you haven't stopped by the Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram accounts for this channel, please do stop by there, where you can see what I'm painting at the moment, and so what videos are going to be coming out in the future. But that is going to do us for today, so until next time, this is Matt from the Plastic Canvas, signing out. Happy painting, everyone. Cheers.